Let's edit some nighttime sports photos in Lightroom. So I've got these photos from a recent Chicago Union practice I went to. This was at night under the lights at a local high school stadium. So a few keys with night photography editing. One is obviously that you just don't have as much light to work with, so you really want to emphasize the highlights when you can. The other big thing to note is color. I feel like a lot of the time night photography drifts more towards yellow when maybe you want it a little bit more blue toned. So be careful with how it comes out of your camera and just be ready to correct those colors yourself and make it feel a little bit more realistic. I'm gonna go through a few different techniques I like to use when I'm editing nighttime sports photos, and feel free to pick your favorites, make adjustments as needed, but I figured it'd be helpful to show some insight into my process with these. So let's start with this Sam Kaminsky portrait photo. Right off the bat, cropping is the first thing I always do, so hitting C in Lightroom to pull up my crop. I'm gonna get rid of this top right light and just keep the light that's kind of like framing the face, and you're getting that nice like rim light on the nose. I'm gonna crop this down, holding shift so it maintains the aspect ratio. And I'm not gonna center his face, I'm gonna center this light. It's kind of nice having like this wall of black on one side, kind of emphasizes the scene. I like the simplicity of just having subject, light, and that's about it. So let's mess with our lighting conditions to even further that concept. I think we can bring the exposure down a little bit just because of how well lit his face is. Maybe we play with the contrast. I mean, honestly, this like little glow of the light pole, I don't know if you could see it so well in the video. I don't know how much we need that. I might try to erase that completely. If you raise the contrast, you can see it's like disappearing, but obviously we don't want that affecting our subject. So let's keep playing with these. I think the highlights, maybe we boost a little bit. Shadows, you can see what happens if you boost them all the way. I don't think we need that much detail for this particular edit. Again, just because we have some very well lit parts of the subject, I want to keep those while keeping everything else pretty muted in this photo. So we can lower the shadows a little bit. The whites, I think I'm just going to leave. And then the blacks, maybe we can bring those down a bit too. And now you can see with the skin, it's like, it's just looking a little too yellow in my opinion. So I'm gonna blue shift everything a little bit more towards the cooler tones and maybe up the magenta as well, the tint. Saturation is another thing with nighttime sports photography. I don't want anything to be too saturated. I mean, typically these shots are gonna be pretty noisy. This one is actually looking okay, but when it's really noisy and you're upping the saturation, that noise is gonna kind of have a negative effect on the color and the image overall. So I like to desaturate things. It's also just like a feature of the night, and when there's less light hitting things, typically things are more desaturated. And then I like the shade of the penny. I'm not gonna change that blue, but you could do that in the color mixer here if you wanted to shift that towards a different color. I mean, maybe we wanna cool it down a bit or make it more of like a lighter tone. It's not bad. Texture and clarity, I think we can be careful with these. Again, just when you're dealing with noisier images, you don't want to blow them out too much, but a little bit, I think, can still make a good difference. And then vignetting, I typically bring vignetting down for like all of my nighttime sports photos, and it's particularly when we have this black background. It's just not important to have like the edges visible, really, and again, brings further attention to your subject, which ideally is positioned towards the middle of the frame. So we can bring it down to like -30. Going down to noise reduction, this is something that's just gonna depend on the image. Like when I zoom in, this really isn't too noisy for me at all, so I don't think I'm gonna mess with it. But if you did wanna denoise it and just up the luminance manual noise reduction, you can see it just kind of smooths out everything. But again, I like a little bit of graininess in this shot, so I'm gonna keep it as is. Back to this light pole, we can get rid of that if we just wanna brush it out and see how that looks. You can click this masking icon on the right side, go to your brush, and I'm just gonna start painting. And you can see it's showing the area that it's gonna be affecting in red. And now we can just decrease the highlights in that spot and maybe the shadows too. And all of a sudden we no longer have that light pole. Now we don't want it affecting our subject at all. So let's take that mask away by holding Option, and that triggers your eraser tool. Let's erase the part that was going over the lower lip there, and you can go back to your main menu. So we can see it before and after of this one. Again, you can tell the blue shift does this image some favors, in my opinion. I think it's just a little too yellow in this case. I do think removing the distraction of that light pole is something I would keep in this final image, and no need to denoise in this case too. Just a little bit of texture and clarity can bring out that detail. Let's move on to our next image. This is Henry Goldenberg action shot. Again, let's hit C for a crop tool. Right off the bat, let's remove some of these edges. We don't need the other player hands. And I do want to keep this full light in the image. I'm also going to rotate this. You can see how the light is kind of on a slant right now. I want to make it more vertical. So just straightening this image like so. And we can even line up this light pole with this third line, stick to the rule of thirds. You can also get it a little bit more precisely. And with this edit, we can start going through our lighting conditions. Maybe we up the exposure a little bit on this one, up the contrast. Don't want to decrease the highlights too much. In fact, we'll leave it right about there. For the shadows, I'm a little bit interested in having more detail come out on our player here. I don't love adding detail to the light pole, but because it is in a perfectly straight line, I think that's okay. And the emphasis is still kind of on the light source and the player. So let's go with that. And then we can always bring the blacks down to kind of hide some of that extra graininess that's around. Kind of cleans up the whole image by lowering those blacks. This one, again, I think just a little bit more towards the blue tone, but not too much. And then some of that magenta. And by the way, if you're unfamiliar with Lightroom, you can see before and afters just by hitting the backslash key right above the return key on your Mac. I hope PC is the same. One thing you could do with nighttime photos is up the overall black point just by clicking a lower point on your curve and lifting that bottom one. And you can straighten out the rest of this curve just by bringing another point up there. So it's really just taking this black background and making it more of a dark gray, so you get this matte effect. I'm also noticing in the lower right corner, we've got that like little bit of light. I'm just gonna crop that out and make sure there aren't any weird distractions in the corners. We can also take our vignetting again and get rid of any corner detail that way as well. While we're in the effects, we can up the texture and clarity again. And again, don't want to make this too noisy, too detailed. You can see there's a lot more noise in this image than there was in our first image, so just want to be careful with these effects. And I still feel like the skin tone is a bit yellow, so maybe we can take the orange in the color mixer and shift it a little bit more towards the red, something like that. And then I think I want to up the contrast a little bit more still. So maybe around there, you can see that's what we started with. This is where we're currently at. A lot more detail being brought up by the shadows. I don't mind it. I think that works pretty well in this image. And again, up to you on this curves layer, whether you want that black point towards the more pure black or more of a matte finish. But we'll stick with matte in this example just to see where it takes us. I think the saturation is okay, but again, I think I just naturally like a little bit more desaturated. We'll leave this photo here and move on to our next one. I'm gonna go to this action shot, slightly different background because there's a lot more going on, but you still have this like nighttime sky, which I like and I again wanna emphasize. So let's start with cropping. I like that we've got this nice full light source here. I don't love this like text on the right side, so ideally it'd be nice to crop out most of it, but I think we have to be careful. We can't crop in too low while maintaining this aspect ratio just because I do want to keep this light source in. So we'll settle for cropping out that far text, but we'll keep the closer one. Something about there. Can also go back to your crop tool and straighten this out. I like to align this just with anything in the background that makes sense to me. So I see this fence line. I think that's a great target. We can line it up about there. I'm also gonna bring in this edge a little bit and maybe this one too. So now I'm just looking at the edges and making sure it looks clean enough, and it does to me. There's no like weird little details sticking out. Let's again lower the exposure just because I think it's very well lit right now and I don't think it needs to be. I think upping the contrast generally helps with these nighttime shots just because it's accentuating the highlights while decreasing the darker parts of the image, which is typically most of it. Highlights, maybe we can bring up a little bit just because I do like the white on the hoodie and the jersey. The shadows, I think, bring down. If you don't know whether to bring something up or down, just take it to the extreme, see what it does. Whites, I think, will go around there. Blacks, I think, again, lowering these a good bit is a nice effect. Now with this one, Let's again go with that blue shift. I think the magenta is okay. Now this grass is kind of like it goes towards like a neon green when it's under these high school lights. So I like to shift the green, or really it's the yellow sometimes, more towards like a blue tone, or more towards a actual green versus a yellow green. So just playing with these dials, making it a little bit more green and desaturating it as well, just because I don't need like a highlighter effect coming up from the ground. This building color too, I feel like is kind of distracting, and I'd rather desaturate that. So I believe that should be in the yellow tones. Yeah, so you can see the yellow, it's affecting a little bit of our secondary subject there, but mostly the building. So I'm going to desaturate that a good amount. I'm liking this overall desaturated look, so let's move on to some of our effects. Vignetting, again, we can bring those edges down, darken them. And for texture and clarity, I'm actually going to isolate the subject just because there is so much going on in the background. I don't need to texture and clarity everything, just caring about these players. So we're going to go to our mask and click on subject. And Lightroom is going to analyze the photo, find the subject, and then it'll allow us to edit the subject specifically. So it should get both of these players, yes, as it does. And you can see upping the exposure, it's only affecting our subjects here. So we don't really care about exposure in this case. We fixed that already, but texture and clarity, just want to bring a little bit more detail into these players. And we could see what it looks like to up the shadows and stuff, but yeah, I'm kind of thinking we don't really need further edits. So that's looking good to me. We can go back to our master effects. Scrolling down to color grading, that's a tab that we haven't looked at yet. So let's go into color grading. This is where you can kind of get your own custom filter on these photos if you want to do that. So a common sort of cinematic look is to take the shadows down towards the blue cyan tones, and then the highlights up towards like the orange, yellow, red ones, kind of warming up the highlights. Midtones, I feel like it just depends on the photo, what direction I want to take those, but typically I end up going towards the blue tones. So it kind of gives it a little bit more dramatic of a feel. We can look at the before, again, very yellow, very bright, and the after, just like dimming everything and only putting the emphasis on what we care about, which is our subjects. I think that really helps nighttime photos in general. Now I do think this sign on the right side does take away a little bit from our subjects. So we can take a linear gradient mask and just dim that out. Going back to your mask and clicking on that plus, going to linear gradient, is making a new mask, and we can draw out exactly what we want it affecting and just kind of fading it out before it hits the cutout. So we can take down this exposure, maybe not all the way, but somewhat, and I think highlights too. Just again, dimming out this area so eye is going straight towards these subjects and not really wandering about too much in the image. We're gonna stop there for the day. Hopefully this gave you some insight into what goes into editing nighttime sports photography and maybe gave you some ideas of things you can try. Let me know if you have any questions. I'm also always open to feedback. I'm constantly trying to improve as a photo editor, as a photographer. So if you have any feedback on the photos or the editing itself, please let me know. Thanks for watching as always, and I'll see you in the next one.